Okay, great. Thank you. Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. I'm Christiane Hanna, AFP Chicago President for 2020 and Director of Development at Advance Illinois. On behalf of the AFP Continuous Learning Council, I'd like to thank you all for joining us for today's virtual meeting. I'd like to take a moment to thank our pioneer sponsor, Advocate Aurora Health, for their generous support in funding our programming. I would also like to thank our IDEA Education Scholarship Fund sponsor, Campbell & Company. We appreciate your continued support of our chapter. Here at AFP Chicago, we have a tradition of acknowledging our current fellows class at the beginning of each in-person program. In the spirit of this tradition, I'd like to recognize our 2020 AFP fellow class, Vanessa Bonilla, Nina Eliza, Ryan Jameson, Ashley Lugo, and Gabriel Pachter. The AFP Chicago Fellows Program was created in 2004 to offer development professionals educational resources and the collective experience of our membership. Each fellow represents our rich and diverse Chicago philanthropy community. Thank you, Fellows Class of 2020. We're glad you could join us today. Before we get started, we have a few housekeeping items. To keep our audio as clear as possible, we have intentionally muted all of your lines. If you have a question for our panelists, please use the chat feature located at the bottom of your screen. We'll get to as many questions as possible. And finally, an evaluation will be sent following today's presentation. It will include a link to the recording of today's session. And with that, I think I'm going to turn it over to Aaron Rogers. Please correct me if that's not. I'm not sure, is it Derek? Are you?
It's Derek.
On? Okay.
Yep, it's Derek. Okay.
All right. Thanks, Derek. I will turn it over for you to start our fabulous presentation today. Thanks, Derek.
Thank you. Thank you, Christiane. So because of the sensitive nature of today's topic, we thought it might be prudent to share a few ground rules. And those should be in the next slide, if we can advance. There we go. I'm not going to take your time to read them all, but please take a minute, look them over. Much of what you see here is based on the meeting contract currently in use with our AFP affinity group, the White Fundraisers Advocating for Racial Equity. Our speakers are here as members of AFP, and their comments and opinions do not necessarily represent the organizations where they work. Also, there will be opportunity for you to ask our panel questions, but we kindly ask that you please do not ask anything that might be politically leaning. So with that, I'd like to introduce today's presenters. We'll go on to the next slide. Next slide, please. There we go. Today we bring together four well-respected nonprofit professionals to openly explore racism in today's society and how we as members of the nonprofit community can challenge ourselves to be leaders against bigotry and ignorance. The panel is moderated and staffed by a diverse group of frontline fundraisers, each of whom participate in one of AFP Chicago's 5 affinity groups. Today's moderator is Jennifer Holmes. She serves as the Assistant Director of Corporate and Foundation Relations and is my colleague at Rush University Medical Center. Joining Jennifer are 3 panelists. We want to begin with Janelle Chang. She's the Deputy Director of Development at the Obama Foundation and member of the Asian Pacific Islanders Affinity Group. We also have Fred Long. He's the Vice President of Development at UCAN and a member of the African American Affinity Group. And Aaron Rogers, Director of Development for the Hyde Park Arts Center and a member of the White Fundraisers Advocating Racial Equity. And so with that, I'm going to kick it over to my esteemed colleague, Jennifer, and say thank you very much. Jennifer, will you get us started?
Absolutely. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, awesome. So I want to thank AFP Chicago and especially to Tricia Rooney and Derek Lambert for organizing today's event. We are having today's conversation because of decisions made hundreds of years ago. And it is the decision that we've made today to speak our truth and to show up to this dialogue with courage that will empower future generations of frontline fundraisers. So with the time that it is ours to share today, we have 2 goals. One is to impart strategies that may prove useful in journeys of anti-racism. The second aim is to utilize the truths that will be shared by the panelists today to offer validation to the experiences of Black, Indigenous people of color who also serve as fundraisers. For all who identify as Black, Indigenous persons of color, your truth is affirmed. Your right to unapologetically and unconditionally be you in the fullness of your realities is affirmed. You are complete. And with those affirmations, it is my pleasure to open up our dialogue to the panelists as well as to you. We will invite and respond to your questions throughout the panel today instead of waiting to the end. So we'll start with our first question, and I will ask Fred to start off with the response. Becky, if you would move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So starting with Fred today, the realities of race, disparity, and inequity can make one emotionally raw. How do you remain engaged in your work at your organization without allowing your emotions to rule you? So we'll start with Fred, move on to Aaron, and then Janelle.
It's a good question. Thank you, Jennifer. Thanks, AFP, for having me. Before I start, I want to give a disclaimer. Like most of us, I have two elementary and high school students on e-learning, and my wife is home teaching too, so y'all may hear some education in the background during these times, so apologies early on. So as I think about emotions, one, you see me, I'm an African-American man and fundraising, and I'm a vice president, which is an anomaly in itself. So physically, I show up a certain way, unconventional. But as we talk about just emotions, I can speak to an experience that I had recently. We host our flagship fundraiser in June, and we held that event virtually on June 3rd. But leading up to that, George Floyd happened the week before. Mm-hmm. And I was very conflicted and emotionally just all over the place. And I shared that with our team and our executive director, and we were in conversations. I wanted to cancel the entire event, and I thought we should, and I thought it would have been validated that we did that. But two things really helped me navigate through that. One is the spirit of the heritage that lies within me subconsciously to say that I need to be on that stage at this time. And two, I felt like, I would be letting my team down, the organization, and the young people we were providing scholarships down if I didn't participate, because they had put in so much work to get us to that point. And you have to remember, we had just decided to go virtual a few months before, which it was a lot of different moving parts. And so for me, that was a really tough space. And during the opening, we had to pivot our entire platform and program to reflect George Floyd. And we made sure that every element of the program had some of respect and acknowledgement of what was happening. And you have to remember the country, and for that matter, the globe was on fire. And I felt conflicted as an African-American man to be sitting next to our CEO, who was a white man, mm-hmm. on camera smiling when our people are tearing communities up, they're mm-hmm. being oppressed and obviously killed. So it was mm-hmm. It was the most emotional I ever been in this mm-hmm. role. But I shared exactly what I'm sharing with you on the virtual event. And I said, I'm gonna say what I wanna say, and there's no script. And the strength I found in that as a Black man was something that would stay with me forever, and with you, Ken, in our history.
Thank you, Fred. Aaron?
Sure. Yeah, thank you, Fred. I think the emotion that I often feel the most that is challenging is fatigue with this work. I feel overwhelmed often with my job, with the demands for my family, and being a parent and husband, that I often just want to not think about and deal with racism. We know what it's like as fundraisers. We always have more to do than we have time to do. And it's sometimes I just don't feel like I have the energy to go through the readings, the meetings, the seminars, because they're all draining, not just in terms of time, but they're emotionally and mentally draining as well. And so that's something that I have to combat, because I know that my ability to shut off and not think about race is itself a privilege of whiteness. And people of color are confronted with race whether they like it or not. They don't have that ability to just kind of shut it off. And so as a white person, I recognize that if I shut down because I feel fatigued, that means we collectively can only move forward when white people are feeling up to it. And that's not good enough. So we just have to make time for it and prioritize it, and know that this work may infringe on other aspects and our rest, but it is a top priority, and therefore we just need to kind of move through that fatigue.
Janelle?
Yeah, Erin, thank you so much for your vulnerability. Oh, okay, little echo. For your vulnerability and your answers. So I'm gonna dig a little deeper. I love approaching my anti-race, well, love is I say that as an automatic. I approach my anti-racist work through this like symptoms versus root cause framework. Like, are we just really treating a symptom, or are we getting to the root cause? And when I look at the term without allowing your emotions to rule you, that kind of triggers me. To me, that seems like you're just treating a symptom. And so what is that root cause? And so I start to question, what is the perception of emotional state? Like, who's determined what is emotion, like what and who is emotional at work? And what standard are we comparing ourselves to when it comes to emotions, especially at the workplace? So if you like really break it down, like we know that emotional labor is defined as a regulation of one's feelings at work. It takes effort and then control to display what an organization deems is appropriate. And so I think this also feeds into this idea of an expectation of generally what professionalism means. And in truth, expectations in the workplace for professionalism is rooted in white supremacy. And so, yes, is that bold? Yes. And so I would say like these spaces, like, kind of scoping out to the nonprofit industrial complex and then the institutions that are within it, they're not made by Black, Indigenous people of color, and they're not meant for us. And so then we are beholden, once we're in these places, by these white professional standards that is based on history, biases, and conditioning. And so then for Black, Indigenous people of color staff, we're taking on more emotional labor to fit a norm that's not meant for us. And so I know for so many, there's like this level of dissonance between like what you have, what is expected out of us, but also like versus what we are feeling. And so there's a lot of flexing that we have to do. Everybody knows like we have to code switch to be able to see the white standard, right? We know that a lot of leadership don't reflect us. They're white leadership, so we're beholden to their perceptions of emotional state. And so I say all of this to say that rather than telling us to regulate our emotions, I think we need to think about what professional standards are, like what does it really look like, and question why we keep adhering to ideals that are rooted in white supremacy. I urge everybody here, if you haven't already, to start like understanding this, reading Tima Akun's White Supremacy Culture white paper, which is going to be linked later in the presentation. She really breaks down how white supremacy shows up in your organization under this guise of professionalism. I know I go to this paper every time like I feel like I'm being gaslit or I have imposter syndrome, and I feel that stirring, right? That emotion. And I remind myself like, you know what? It's not me. It's the standards that I have been beholden to. And so I invite everybody to like think of Fred's story. And oh gosh, Fred, I really hope you took a mental health day after that. Thank you so much for doing that. and for Erin and working through your fatigue. I also hope you take mental health breaks as well. But like really think critically and question like these standards that we're beholding ourselves to, question our biases, and really how do we shift professionalism to actually like through the lens of being anti-racist, and how we can change organization policies around that so we can be emotional. Because we tell our donors all the time, like we pitch to them so we can pull on their emotional heartstring, but you can't, but you're saying that staff aren't allowed to feel emotion of our mission. I think that's a misalignment. Thanks, Jennifer.
You're welcome. Thank you, Janelle, Aaron, and Fred. We do have a few minutes where we can take questions from the audience on this particular subject of managing emotions, the real emotions that that come to the surface when we, directly address matters and the realities of race disparity and equity. I do not see any questions right now popping up in the chat, and that's okay. You all can think about it, and you can definitely plug in your questions as we go along. So we'll move on to question 2, which is related to Janelle's comments. And, we want to talk about what does it mean when we shift those cultural norms that we have to fundraise in, and what does authentic advocacy and alliance look like from our white colleagues. And I will ask Aaron to get us started with this particular question. Aaron?
Sure, thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, I have a lot of different thoughts, and so I'll try to keep them sort of streamlined. To me, I think that I'm getting some feedback, sorry, that as white people, we have to begin with a clear understanding of race in America and our role in it. Systemic racism and all the many ways that it's manifested in our institutions and in our culture was designed by white people to benefit white people and put white people in power. And whether white people have really benefited from racism as designed, I think that's a complex topic that we can't dive into now, but we can say that white people clearly have power. Whether it's across institutions or government or distribution of wealth, white people have a disproportionate amount of power. And so if we as a country and a society are really going to address racism, white people for whom the system was designed and who are granted the power have to be a part of this solution. We need to be leaders in this work, not the only leaders, everyone has a role to play, but we have to step up and recognize our responsibility as it has been a part of the history of this country and how it's been designed to place us in certain positions. So that, in a lot of ways, I think probably sounds hopefully a little bit like a call to action. But even that I want to pause on because our culture tends to value action over reflection. And, especially as fundraisers, right? I mean, we're kind of we're taught to get things done. I think Derek called us box checkers, and that's certainly me. I have my list. I want to get things done. Let's get moving. But when it comes to something as complex and deeply embedded in our society, I think reflection is a really powerful action. We have been socialized into racism, and it works on us subconsciously. So if we as white people are going to address racism, first, we have to address it in ourselves. I think that means accepting responsibility, means doing the work of self-reflection and education, reading, being a part of conversations, talking to our peers and so forth, and pushing ourselves into uncomfortable headspaces. Not for the goal of focusing on guilt or anything like that, but to find personal honesty on what is a very complex and confusing topic. And that sort of journey of self-reflection needs to be constant throughout our lives, really. We always need to be doing that self-reflection work and work to educate ourselves. I think that's really the most important thing that we can do. My final point is that as we start to look outside ourselves, I use this notion called organize your own. And without kind of going into the history of that, to me, what it really means is, focus on what's around us and focus on mobilizing ourselves and other white people. So instead of going to our Black or Latinx or Asian coworkers and saying, I think racism is bad, what should we do? Instead, let's go to our fellow white coworkers, or parents in our kids' schools or whatever it is and say, I think racism is bad. Let's discuss how we can make our organization better for our fellow coworkers or make our kids' school better for all the classmates. And so to me, I think that what I aspire to do, and what I hope other white peers do, is to focus on the work that we can do as white people and have our lens focused on the actions of white people, because to me, that's where the change needs to happen, or at least our focus for the change needs to happen.
Thank you, Aaron. Fred, do you want to jump in on this question?
Yeah, I will preface and say that what does Advocacy Alliance and from our white colleagues look like looks different to different people. So there's no general broad template for this. And if somebody of color says that it is, I would challenge them in a heartbeat, because we see these things differently and it means something differently to us. So I'll start there. But, you know, as I think about advocacy, so that means you already have to have some understanding before you even get to it to be able to advocate on my behalf. You have to have some foundation understanding of who I am, my cultural norms, and my hurts and pains. And I don't think most of white America understand that for Black people, period. Let alone a Black fundraiser in this space, who's basically, as we talk about DEI and equity, I'm almost guaranteed of every institution that's on this call, your funder or donor base don't reflect in totality your service population or your workforce. So as we talk about fundraising, for me, those are areas right now that at UCAN that I'm starting to spend a lot of time with. Because every other area of our institution, from our service population, our leadership team, board, have all went through this process of being very diverse and equitable. But there's, you know, this misnomer that, you know, the African-American culture can't be donors as well. And so that's something I would challenge everyone to start to pay more attention to in terms of your supporters. But for me, if you're asking me what you are, Advocacy Alliance from white people will look like this. Utilize some of that privilege, share the wealth, help us and provide platforms, and then get out the way. You understand? If you really want equity, we don't need you driving the bus all the time. Let us drive, but help us create it by sharing some of that. And then get out my way and allow me to be who I am.
Thank you so much, Fred. Janelle, did you want to jump in on this question?
Yeah, I mean, Fred said it.
Yeah.
But I think some things I will kind of add to that is that we learn a lot about in this spaces, like we need a mentor or be a mentor. I've learned in the last couple of years, like to be a sponsor. And sponsor really means to uplift somebody who is not in the room with you. And so it's like every time you're in a meeting, look around the room and see like who's actually at this meeting and table, and who would we actually benefit from hearing from. And then if you're in that room and you notice that certain voices, particularly from your Black, Indigenous, people of color, are not having the platform to speak, give them that platform to speak. As Fred said, get out of the way and have them speak. If there's a project that needs to be led on, that this is a growth opportunity for somebody, for your staff of color, you sponsor them, whether they're in the room, and you affirm them even when they're in the room. If there are promotions at your organization, you should 100% back your staff that are Black, Indigenous, people of color for those promotions, rather than automatically going out and hiring externally, particularly if somebody has been teed up and already doing the work and not getting the title and getting the pay. And as Fred was saying, like along these lines about, and also for Aaron too, is like, I would really encourage organizations to invest in their staff and invest in getting paid professionals to do anti-racist and DEI training. And it's like, if somebody gives you a service, you have to pay for them. And so that's why I'm saying, like, these trainings are worthy. They deserve to be, the people coming in deserve to be paid, and they should be led by, you know, Black, Indigenous, people of color. And I get that budgets are tough and we can get creative around that. but also we're fundraisers. So we should be able to fundraise for things that are really important to the organization. And this anti-racist work in organizations is extremely important. I say all of this to say that the reason why I'm saying you have to hire paid professionals is because your staff, your Black, Indigenous, people of color staff, are already doing this work internally. So not only are they doing their fundraising work, they're doing this like anti-racism, like DEI work just simply through their lived experiences, because people are coming to them, asking them for questions, and we're living through it. And they're doing it without merit, they're doing it without resources. And so if you know that the first premise is that this deserves to be paid work, then you need to look about your colleagues that are doing this work and making sure that they get some sort of, give them a paid mental health day, or give them, paid training or something, but do something, because this is really crucial and this is really important.
Okay. Thank you so much, Janelle. We have a couple of questions that came through, and we have about 5 minutes to respond to both of them. So I'm going to take the first one that came through, and it's from Claire Gilpin. And her question is, what advice do you have for those of us on the front lines having to answer our institution's racially fraught histories? So what advice do you have for those of us on the front lines having to respond to their institution's racially fraught issues or histories? That's a good one. That's a good one. Anybody want to take a stab at that one? Because we do have one from Elizabeth that I'd like to share too while we have a few minutes. Aaron?
Sure.
Okay.
I think that number one is being honest. I think that when we are confronted, particularly around issues of race, that it can be very easy to kind of try to deflect or be defensive or state the real history of the organization. And this is something a lot of organizations are dealing with. I know that like Planned Parenthood made some comments recently, their CEO, and I know some environmental groups have done it. In the end, I think honesty has to lead the way, and I think, as fundraisers, a lot of times I realize, mistakes, being honest with them, are actually opportunities. And so recognizing the unfortunate history of the organization, and then hopefully your organization has taken real meaningful steps to improve and focus on those moments of improvement. But I also think this requires humility and never saying that, well, that was in the past, we're so much better now. Understanding that this is a process and that we as an organization are working on that process, and we aspire to improve and ideally become a leader in the sector in this area.
Thank you, Aaron. Before we move on to Elizabeth's question, we have maybe a couple of more minutes to talk about Claire's question. Janelle or Fred, would either of you like to jump in on that before we go to Elizabeth's question? So looking at the history of the organizations and, talking about how they have or how they have not dealt with racism within the organization. Fred?
Yeah, I don't know, that's tough. I think we all should be educated on where we want to work at before we work there anyway, first of all, right? Or look at some of the history and have a conversation with yourself if there's something that you're willing to be a part of. And if so, for me, because I think even UCAN has been around 151 years now, and they didn't always serve predominantly African-American youth, families, and communities. One time it was a Jewish organization on the north side of Chicago. We were founded in the church. And I'm quite sure throughout the century, we've had some people engaged in UCAN's history. It's almost guaranteed there's no way it probably couldn't be, especially at that time, who were probably enslaving people or benefiting from that model. So, I think I go back to what Aaron said. I think as long as folks are willing to put in the energy to accept that, because acceptance is one of the first steps towards healing, which is part of our vision, helping youth and families heal. Now that, I'm a part of an organization that's done kind of transformed into something totally different today. Part of my role and my colleagues at UCAN who are part of this webinar today is it's our job now to make sure that don't ever happen again, and especially not in these times.
Thank you, Fred, for that. Claire is appreciative of the responses. Janelle, did you, we have maybe a few seconds where you can jump in, and then I want to try to get to Elizabeth's question before we move on with the panel. So Janelle?
Yeah, I think any of this situation, like just adding on to what Aaron and Fred said, is like always look and see what reconciliation really means. You can't move forward unless you actually come to address what you've done in the past. And so, Claire, I would say, like, if you can research a little bit more about what reconciliation looks like, really having your organization and leadership look at the history and then own what has been done within that history, and be forward-facing about the public, and be humble and be apologetic, and then point out what it is that you're proactively going to do to be able to shift, and how you can really dedicate your organization to be anti-racist.
Thank you so much to each of you. So we're going to move on to our next question, which it just so happens is very closely aligned to Elizabeth's question. And so what we want to talk about, and I'll actually ask Elizabeth's question because she asked it, she showed up, and I want to make sure that we respond to her. And so Elizabeth's question is, how do you as a fundraiser help shift your team away from fear in talking about white supremacy and anti-racism, which could result in a loss of donors? And so as you read the question on the screen, that's actually what we were going to talk about next, is how we manage conversations about racism with donors. But Elizabeth is asking, how do we manage those conversations with our team also? How we talk to our donors, how do we talk to volunteer leadership like board of directors, and how do we talk to our colleagues about white supremacy, about anti-racism, and how do we mitigate or address the results of what those conversations might be? What do we do with that? So, Fred, I'll start with you in responding to that question.
Yeah, I think it's like, how do you have a conversation? I think it differs between these different categories in here, whether it's your board, your team, which is, as Elizabeth pointed out, volunteer leadership, because those can be committees of the board, or your young professional board, and donors. I think those are all three separate conversations, or four. And how do you have those conversations differ? Because if you think about the board, there's accountability attached to how they represent the organization, which is probably not so much of that accountability when you're working with donors, right? So for me, the first thing I do when I hear somebody say something slick and I'm present, I ask a question. What did that mean? Hey, what was you inferring right there? No, we can't say that. So I'll ask a question, so I call them qualifiers. Hey, why did you refer to North Lawndale as a violent place? Although it is, but the subtlety in it, you can't say that. I can say it. And whether you think it's fair or not, why did you say that? So that's how I talk to donors. And with our board, we have a 15-year diversity, equity, and inclusion report that was published last fall in 2019, prior to COVID and what we're seeing globally with social injustice. We've been working at this for quite some time at UCAN, and making sure that our board now is over 50% minority majority. And that's not symbolic, that was efforts, because in the 90s, believe it or not, when I came to UCAN as a client, our board was like most boards at that time, was 100% white. And we made a very intentional, strong effort with our board members to talk about and take them through Ta-Nehisi Coates and have race-based conversations back in the early 2000s. So now we're providing refreshers now even more than ever with our board, the committees of our board, our resource development committee, and our internal staff and team, and especially the folks that's part of my team, so that they feel like they have a space to talk about this. Most of our team meetings now, since George Floyd and Blake and Breonna Taylor, we start with a check-in now around how you feeling in this space.
Thank you, Fred. I appreciate your comment about asking questions. That is not only a direct way to get folks to think about what they've said, but it also is not aggressive at the same time, to just ask someone a question about what they really meant about something that they said. So thank you so much for that. That is a strategy that I hope our colleagues will employ within their organizations, regardless to whether they're talking to colleagues, to board or committee members or community partners or volunteers. Ask questions, just ask questions, and that really opens up opportunities for dialogue. Janelle, did you want to jump in on this particular question and offer, in response to Elizabeth, as well as to offer some strategies that our colleagues can employ?
Yeah, I think a lot of my own colleagues and peers know I love resources, as I popped in an article in the chat, and we are going to share more at the end of the presentation. But I would say please check out community-centric fundraising if folks don't know about them already or do. They are a movement coming out from the West of really trying to move away from being donor-centric to be community-centric in this way of looking at fundraising and decolonizing and really shifting what it means to move the power away from privilege and wealth to back to the community which we are serving. They have a Alliance worksheet, and there's a section that's saying like having challenging conversations with donors. I think you can also apply that for volunteer leadership as well. I do know that my peers, we do ask for organizations for a couple things, but this is something that could be an exercise that you could do with your team. And for folks on the team who are leaders, please allow that space. There should be organized the organization have approved talking points for major gift officers or any fundraisers that are externally facing, and for volunteer leadership on how to talk around your organization is dedicated to being anti-racist and around DEI. Of course, with that assumption that that is something that your organization should be looking at, and that's just something we should all be pushing for. You should have specific talking points for Black, Indigenous, people of color, frontline staff for these difficult conversations, because I will guarantee you that majority of the donors that you're in front of, as Fred said, did not reflect the community. You're putting a lot of the staff of color in front of white donors. And so what is that? And then looking at the power dynamic of that, and it could be very uncomfortable. And so making sure that they are equipped with the tools and trainings to be able to, beyond talking points, be able to be in those situations, which goes into what I'm always saying, like invest in trained professionals, like invest in Black, Indigenous, people of color professionals for your staff, whether it's, trauma counseling or negotiation even. And then of course, what we'll dive into later is about affinity groups and doing like policy changes in your work to ensure that your staff feel good and comfortable about how they can be ambassadors of your organization.
Thank you so much, Janelle. We have a question from L. Marshall, and it actually moves us, I believe, a response to their question, which is how do you recruit to ensure the board reflects the clients served? So that is a question that's asked often by nonprofit organizations. And I believe that we can answer that question through the AFP Chicago Affinity Groups question, which is our next one, where we're talking about the value that you all have seen and experienced from the AFP affinity groups. I believe that most of them started at the end of last year in December, and they are, they are remarkable, quite honestly. I participate in 3 of them and have found them very valuable. And so the reason why I lift those affinity groups up right now in response to L. Marshall's question about recruitment is because those affinity groups are attended by frontline fundraisers and philanthropists. And so we're able to have conversations with subject matter experts in those affinity groups about this specific issue of how do we recruit not only boards that reflect the clients that we serve, but fundraisers that reflect the clients that we serve. And you find that knowledge and that support in the AFP Chicago affinity groups. And so I want to move to our last question for the panel, which is if you all would share what value you have found in your participation in the AFP Chicago affinity groups. Janelle, I'll start with you.
Sure.
And if you would share the affinity group that you participate in, that will be helpful to our audience, I'm sure.
Yeah, so I am part of the Asian Pacific Islanders affinity group. We just started this year, and it is a treasured space. One tactic I will share with L. Marshall directly is that when I worked at the Chicago Sinfonietta, their boutique orchestra with a mission of diversity, we partnered very closely with Chicago United. Chicago United, I'm not sure if folks know, they're basically an organization that is like a membership base for racially diverse CEOs and executive level management. And so I'm not saying that your board has to be at that C-suite executive, kind of corporate side, but that was a partnership that really helped us find board members who not only were diverse because of our mission, but also just like in their values and affinity for classical music. Which is really great. So that's just one tip I'll put out there. Going back to affinity groups, so I will share that I've been working in this field for over 11 years, and I calculated the other day, I've had 16 managers, and I'm not saying I had 16 jobs. Like in one job, I had 6 managers I reported to, but I've had 16 managers, and out of the 16, everyone was white except for 1. And so I say that to say, like, my entire career, I've always been looking for representation. I've been looking for leadership and just even other fundraisers that look like me and are diverse and reflect, as Fred said, the community in which we serve. And so I've always just kind of been looking for different types of groups and memberships to have shared experiences with in cross to fundraising tactics and strategies, right? And so I joined AADO, historically known as the African American Development Officers, founded by Birgit Burton. Shout out, she's phenomenal. Please look up AADO, which now they are more multicultural, and she like scooped me in, and that was one of the first communities that I've joined that I was like, oh, this space, there's leaders that look like me, and they're raising money in a way that and support, I take away money, raising support in a way that I have not been exposed to. When COVID hit, I personally was a victim of xenophobia, and I was racially targeted for being Asian during COVID. And so, you're quarantined. I live alone in Chicago. I'm by myself, but I was also, so I was like really struggling, and I really needed to find some sort of community, but I also know that I have to work. And so a really great close friend of mine, Carlos Trejo, who is also very involved with AFP, like connected me to Christopher Chanson. And then I also had a friend, Jay Hobart, and the 3 of us got together and we're like, hey, fellow APIs, we exist, there's more than one of us. And then kind of launched our affinity group. And this space has been a place where we can get together to have conversations that are just different. Behind closed doors, we talk about things that are very different than spaces like this, to be quite honest. They're safe, we have similar experiences, and I'm just so grateful to have that community and that fellowship and learn fundraising tactics that intersect with our racial identity.
Aaron, would you mind jumping in
Of course, yeah, thank you.
on, are you, that you read? Okay.
Yes, so I am a member of the White Fundraisers Advocating for Racial Equity. Sometimes they call it YFAIR. It's been, to me, a wonderful experience working with some of the other organizers and getting to know the participants. I think there's a lot of value to the group. I think, first of all, the group itself, its mere existence, is a public declaration of white anti-racism. And I think that declaration itself matters and is meaningful. It's not an end unto itself, but I think its existence itself is important. As I've said, I think white people don't always have the same experience or the depth of experience considering race that a lot of people have. So affinity groups are places that we can really educate ourselves and share resources and be better prepared to have these conversations with our Alana peers and network. It's also a place that we can really just explore ourselves. As a white person, I've made mistakes. I've said things that were hurtful. I've made assumptions that were wrong, and I've been ignorant. And I don't think these were out of malice, but I needed to grow. I need to address them. And that's vulnerable, but I think these spaces are places that we can be vulnerable and grow and learn from our mistakes as well as similar mistakes other white people have made. So again, this is not about wallowing in regret or guilt. It's about, these are really about forward-looking organizations and how we can do better. And again, I go back to that notion of reflection as a powerful action. And I think these spaces are places for reflection. And then finally, while I think a white anti-racist affinity group is a resource for white anti-racism, I think it can also be a resource for other affinity groups and organizations. If those groups or leaders are looking to collaborate with white people, they know they have kind of a place they can start, at least start a conversation, and hopefully, we can work together, and that they know they have kind of allies in that space.
Thank you so much, Aaron. And Fred, we have about a couple of minutes for you to respond about the affinity groups, if you would like to.
Yeah, even at UCAN, I think I'm probably part of about four affinity groups. We have probably about 12 internally that supports over 700 employees. So I like the idea of them. And then, when I had the conversation about, joining AFP for this conversation, reached out to you, Jennifer. And so thank you for connecting me with Ishan, which we had a conversation. So now I'm part of the African American Affinity Group, part of AFP. So I had a good conversation with the team. I believe I joined one meeting so far. Look forward to bringing this type of energy that you feel from me today into those conversations, and having conversations not about fundraising. I think sometimes we get paralysis by analysis, and it's overwhelming sometimes, emotionally. So I think it's times, as you heard Janelle said, just to check out, whether it's a mental check out or me, me, I'm gonna go and pull me up some hand straight up. I'm gonna just be totally honest with you. Take my time. That's what I do, and so that's the type of dude you get.
Fred, I don't know if you can hear us. I think the screen froze up. But when it unfreezes, we'd like to hear. There we go. Okay. I think we lost you at hand, but go ahead.
Oh, yeah. I'm just saying those are things that I'm just honest about. A lot of times, I think those are the human parts of us that we try to mask and veil. I don't. So those are the things that I like to bring, to the group. If I can offer anything in the last pieces, I'm not a poser, and I believe there are a lot in our communities of color, people posing just for attention and trying to just be in the spotlight. So
yeah,
I'd love to have those conversations, because it's no time for that, and it creates division.
Okay. Right. Thank you. Thank you so much, Fred. We are about to close out. This is all the time that we have for our panel. I hope that our attendees enjoyed it and that you've taken away some strategies that you can employ in your own journeys of anti-racism, and some strategies that you can take back to your teams and to your organizations and your volunteer leadership, because that's what we wanted. That's one of the things we wanted to do today, in addition to affirming our peers that are Black, Indigenous, people of color, and your experiences and your truth. I'll now turn the session over to Tricia Rooney.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. My name is Tricia Rooney, and I'm a member of AFP's Continuous Learning Council. We are so appreciative to all of our presenters today, Jennifer, Fred, Aaron, and Janelle. Certainly, we are very pleased to have brought a host of thoughts and strategies today as we all work to make change within our fundraising work. As far as some housekeeping notes, I'd like to point out that please remember evaluations will be sent to you electronically. And along with the survey that will be sent out, there will be a link to the recording of today's program. And we will also email a list of the resources mentioned in today's program to further your interest and education on racism. Additionally, I wanted to point out some of our upcoming programs by AFP. If you can advance the slide. As Jay Hobart shared today in our chat, at 3 o'clock today, the AFP Chicago Asian Pacific Islander Affinity Group will be meeting. There are pop-up talks coming up, specifically Tuesday, October 27th at noon and Wednesday, November 4th at noon. On November 11th at 8 a.m., as Patricia shared on our chat today, the Wayfarer Group, Affinity Group will be meeting. That's the Chicago White Fundraisers Advocating for Racial Equity. And also on December 4th, AFP Chicago will have their annual meeting and awards program. The annual meeting will be at 11:30 until 12, and the awards program will be from 12 to 1 p.m. Please check the AFP Chicago website to register or for more information on these programs. Again, I wanted to offer our thanks to our presenters and all of you for joining today. We hope to be able to get together with all of you in person very soon. AFP fellows, please stay on the call as we will transition to you directly. Everyone, please enjoy the rest of your day, your weekend, and please stay safe and well. Thank you again.